Yes,
Take it away.
thank you so thank you so much, Mr. Mike Knoch, for the very kind introduction and also the invitation to give the keynote this morning. Welcome and good morning, everybody. Happy to be here and yeah, to give an overview on the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Ingo Mike Knoch has already outlined the key points I think I want to sketch out in the presentation. And maybe before I start and introduce the topic, let me say a few words about VDZ. I'm not sure if every one of you is familiar with us. As has been said, we have a very 150 years tradition as the German Cement Works Association. We're based in Düsseldorf and have an office in Berlin too. So we're around 200 people. But our work rests also on other areas than just being an association. We have a strong focus on research and development in the manufacture and use of hydraulic binders. We have a unit that deals with service and consulting. So we support the cement producers in Germany, Europe, and worldwide in technical improvements and many other fields, of course, also in decarbonization. And the last part is really a separate and independent unit that we have, which focuses on certification of building materials, but also of management systems. And also we're active in the field of CO2 verification when it comes to the emissions trading system. And in the future, also CO2 verification under the CBAM. But more on that in a few minutes. So the topic of today is the CBAM, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the instrument. I guess some of you have been dealing with this for a longer time. For others, it's a newer topic. So I try to find the right balance of detail and being general and giving an overview, and I hope this is caters to your needs perfectly. So why the CBAM? Why do we need this instrument? Why does the European Commission introduce such an instrument? I think the answer is quite clear. We have currently a world of unequal carbon prices. As you can see here on the chart, only a quarter of global CO2 emissions is covered by CO2 pricing mechanisms. And of course, this creates certain challenges. And these challenges can be addressed with different instruments, and one instrument can be a carbon border adjustment mechanism. More specifically, of course, we have the issue that if just CO2 pricing is implemented in certain jurisdictions and not in others, you have a higher cost in these areas compared to those without CO2 pricing. And of course, this poses the risk of carbon leakage. I think this is very familiar to all of you. And at the same time, we have ambitious climate targets. And so the question is, how can we maintain a CO2 price signal and incentivize investments in decarbonization of production of basic industries such as cements, chemicals, steel, and so on, and at the same time maintain competitiveness? And this is really a difficult challenge to tackle. And the solution that has now been found for a number of sectors in Europe is this carbon border adjustment mechanism, as it aims to maintain a CO2 price signal. And I will get back to that in a moment. And at the same time, ensure that there's a level playing field on carbon pricing with third country producers. And this becomes even more relevant in the coming years as the free allocation of allowances to European installation will be phased out gradually. So the carbon price paid will increase. And in the same way, this is the plan, the carbon border adjustment will also slowly increase the carbon price for those imports covered by the CBAM. But more on that in a moment. So what is the principle of CBAM? You can see it here. We have the European Union and the European emission system as an area with a CO2 cap and trade system. All installations under the EU ETS are obliged to report verified emissions on an annual basis and surrender CO2 certificates and pay the CO2 price. And the idea is that now starting with 2026, importers of the covered CBAM goods must also report embedded CO2 emissions of the imported products and also submit CBAM certificates that reflect the carbon price in the EU ETS to settle the price difference that we have or that we had before. For exports, the EU is still struggling to find a solution. It's a bit tricky to address this issue. So what happens to exports that have been originally produced under the EU ETS and are transported and sold to markets without a CO2 price? The question is, how can we also manage the issue of competitiveness with respect to exports? And this is still ongoing. Yes, and so why is the carbon border adjustment mechanism such an important tool also from a cement industry perspective? I think it becomes rather clear when you look at the two graphs on the right-hand side. You see on the one hand how EU imports of cement and clinker have developed over the past 10 years. You see that imports have been increasing significantly, which aligns to a certain extent also with the CO2 price, which is the gray line that you see. And at the same time, we see the deterioration of EU exports of cement and clinker. So we see that the carbon price, among other factors, of course, has an impact on the competitiveness. And we need a solution to level the playing field in carbon costs. And that's why the carbon border adjustment mechanism now starts into the trading phase as of 1st January 2026. So let me now go a step further and make you familiar with the current state of implementation of the CBAM. I will do this in a step-by-step manner because the whole instrument is rather complex. I have to say it has very different angles that you need to look at in order to understand the instrument. And so please don't hesitate to raise your hands in case of questions, of course. So first of all, which products are covered by the CBAM? Many of you will know this, but nevertheless, I thought it's good to start with that slide. We see it's just a number of products. It's cement and cement clinker and calcined clays, for example. When we talk about our sector, it's iron and steel and a lot of products that are associated with the production of iron and steel. It's aluminium, it's fertilizers, electricity, and hydrogen so far. But the EU Commission intends to broaden the scope of the CBAM in the coming years. So where do we stand in terms of implementation right now? We've had a 2-year reporting phase that helped, I hope helped third country producers and importers to get familiar with the system on the CO2 reporting for the imported products. As of this year, imported CBAM products have to pay a carbon price. And with that come some other obligations that have to be fulfilled in order to be able to import CBAM products into the EU as of this year. First is a reporting and payment obligation for CO2 emissions associated with the import of CBAM products. You're, I think, familiar with that. In order to import, you need to have a CBAM declarant who is registered in this CBAM registry and who must be located within the European Union. And this registration must have happened until end of March this year. Then in the next step, a submission of the CBAM declaration, which is basically the emission report on the embedded emissions of imports, has to be verified on the one hand and has to be submitted by September 30th of next year, and then on an annual basis. And equivalent to the number of CBAM imports of the embedded carbon that has to be effectively paid for, you have to surrender certificates in the same amount, but I will get to the calculation in a moment. In order to get these CBAM certificates, there will be also a market platform where a purchase of CBAM certificates is possible. This trading of CBAM certificates will, however, only start from February 2027, which has more, I would say, organizational reasons. So the trading for 2026 imports will only happen in 2027. But to make this clear, imports of 2026 are already subject to this carbon pricing. And the carbon price for the first quarter of 2026 is, for example, 75 euros. So this will be then one part of the equation to calculate the effective number of CBAM certificates that have to be purchased. How is CBAM, let's say, managed and operated right now at the borders when it comes to imports? Right now, we have I would say, a governance structure which is headed by the European Commission. And then under the European Commission, in all EU member states, competent CBAM authorities have been installed. And those CBAM authorities, they check the CBAM declarations, so on the imported volumes of product, on the imported embedded emissions, and they cross-checked with the customs data. So right now, it's a very much a document-based test. But in the coming years, the checks will be certainly more thorough and also include sampling of imports for certain products and so on. But this is still work in progress. So how does the CBAM operate? I think I kind of outlined the workflow a little bit, and the chart that you see illustrates it. Maybe the green bar is the platform that combines all the information and organizes the exchange of information. It's the EU CBAM registry. So CBAM declarants must have an account there. Also, non-EU producers or plants can register there. There's a separate foreign country producer platform integrated into the CBAM registry, which shall simplify the flow of information between the producer and maybe also different CBAM declarants. And on the other side, you have the European Commission and the national competent authorities who check the data. They, of course, also have access to this registry. And in case, as a producer of a CBAM product, you use precursor materials from another producer, for example, you purchase clinker or calcined clay to produce cement or clinker, these data also have to be included in the platform, and the third country producer has to make sure he or she gathers this information when reporting emissions. This is just a slide to illustrate that there's this CBAM register also for operators of third country installations. It's a separate portal. I don't want to go into the details here. You will receive the slides afterwards. You see the links included in case you want to make yourself familiar with the portal. And now maybe more on the details of the CBAM and the CBAM obligation that is then reflected in the CO2 price to be paid for imports. Let me start with this. It's a schematic illustration and an example to show how the free allocation in the EU ETS today and the introduction of the CBAM, how they work together in the coming years, and how eventually, as of 2034, free allocation will not take place anymore. And so the full auctioning of CO2 certificates for EU producers will be the norm, and at the same time, importers will then also have to pay the full carbon price, but step by step. So what you see here on the left-hand side of the chart is the world without the CBAM until the end of 2025. You have, for cement, for example, clinker, you have a product-specific CO2 benchmark, which used to be 693 kilograms per ton of clinker. So this was the average of the 10 most efficient installations in Europe. So up to this level of benchmark, an EU installation used to receive free allocation based on historic activity level data, and emissions going beyond the 693, the EU installation had to pay CO2 price or had to purchase CO2 certificates and then surrender certificates. So on this light blue shaded area that you see on top of the bars. This CO2 price was only carried by EU installations, of course, and not by third country producers unless another system is in place there as well. So what changes now with the CBAM is that step by step, gradually, this purchasing of CO2 certificates will become the standard. So you see that on a gradual basis in 2026, it's 97.5% of free allocation still available to EU producers, and the same level of allocation will also be available for third country imports. And so as you see on the chart, year by year, the level of free allocation will be reduced. In 2030, it will only be 51.5%. So only half of the free allocation that we used to have will be available in 2030. The rest has to be purchased on the market. And by 2033, as you see on the right-hand side of the chart, EU installations will have to pay the full carbon price for the entire emissions of an installation. And so will also EU imports be treated. So also the CBAM obligation to purchase certificates will cover the full embedded CO2 of imports. So the idea is to give some planning certainty, and this phasing out and phasing in, I think, gives all market players also the chance to get used to this, and also, of course, the market to get used to this. So the next question that arises is which emissions are covered by the CBAM? I assume you're all familiar with the different types of emissions, Scope 1 emissions being the direct emissions, Scope 2 being the indirect emissions from the electricity consumed, and Scope 3 emissions by other emissions in the upstream or downstream value chain. So what is covered in the CBAM is first Scope 1 emissions for the production of the CBAM good. In our case, it's cement or clinker or also calcined clay, for example. It is the Scope 2, so the electricity consumed to produce the CBAM goods, clinker, cement, and others. And the third part is also precursor materials, as I said before, for the production of clinker. Of course, they now also have to be covered. If you, for example, purchase clinker from another installation. What is not covered is transportation, other raw materials that are not mentioned here. So it's really a Scope 1 and 2 and precursor materials. And in order to set up a stringent and I think transparent monitoring, we've developed with the CO2 protocol of the Global Cement and Concrete Association, a useful tool for cement producers across the world to keep track of their production volumes, of their energy and CO2 volumes, and to make sure that this accurate reporting is possible. So I think this is something that can also be used in order to prepare for CBAM emission verification, for example, and we can also be of help when implementing such CO2 monitoring systems. So now that we've identified the type of emissions covered, the next question is, how do you calculate the CO2 intensity of the imported product? CBAM allows for two ways to do this. One is the installation or the imported product reports based on verified CO2 emissions according to the respective regulations and implementing acts. This is basically a reflection of the obligations for EU producers, right? That's what we do in EU ETS installations for many years already. So it's an annual reporting, it's externally checked and verified, and based on this verified emission report, you surrender the amount of allowances necessary. The other option that CBAM allows for is the use of default values for different countries. So what the EU Commission has done in the past years, it has collected data for all trading partners of the EU and has tried to find reliable data on embedded CO2 emissions for the CBAM goods. For many countries, this has worked quite well, not for all products, but there's a big document, a big spreadsheet available that indicates the default values for many products for most countries of the world. And these default values can be used also for the reporting on the embedded emissions of products. This is basically what the box says that just appeared. So you can use these average default values per country, and to give an incentive, that's the idea behind it, to use actual verified emissions, a markup of 10% in 2026, 20% in 2027, and 30% in 2028 is added to this country average. If for certain countries, this data and products, this data is not available, the alternative is to go to the default values of the 10 countries with the highest CO2 emission intensities. These are very high values that have been calculated based on these 10 countries with the highest emissions. And on top comes a markup here as well. So I think that's not really an attractive option. It's really either, I believe, the use of the standard default values for the countries or the use of verified emissions. To give you an example how this spreadsheet that I just mentioned looks like, I'd like to share with you the example of Morocco. This is just randomly chosen. You see here on the left-hand side the different products, and the same applies to aluminium products, steel products, all CBAM goods, and for all trade partners of the EU. And you see in the spreadsheet itself, there's, for example, for gray clinker, there's a default value for direct emissions. It's 815 kilograms for Morocco. There's a default value for the electricity CO2 footprint from the grid, which is 60 kilograms. It's a specific calculation, but it adds up here to 900 kilograms, should be 910, but 900 kilograms. And then this markup of 10% is added. So if you would import a gray clinker from Morocco into the EU using the standard default value, you would have to declare embedded emissions of 990 kilograms. And this is then part of the equation that I will show later to calculate the effective carbon price paid, which is, of course, just a small fraction of that. In case data is not available in the way you see it here, the fallback option is the relevant one to consider, which is the default value of the 10 countries with the highest emissions. And I mean, it's pretty obvious. If we again look at a gray cement clinker, for example, you see that the default value for direct emissions is 1,370 kilograms, and so on and so forth. So the embedded carbon is much higher than for the standard value, of course. So in order to calculate the number of CBAM certificates that have to be purchased, there is an equation that can be used to calculate this. Basic principle is you have the direct and indirect emissions of the import, and you deduct from that the free allocation in the ETS that I've shown before. And the CBAM factor, this is this percentage that is gradually reduced in order to come down to zero free allocation at some point. And if you do this math, you end up basically with the number that you need. So this is the equation. You have the quantity of the product multiplied with the emission intensity. Then you have the ETS benchmark that is deducted. The CSCF you can ignore. That's a sectoral correction factor that is not applied currently. So this is just one. The carbon leakage factor is one. And then you have the CBAM factor of 97.5 this year. So you multiply the emission intensity and the quantity with subtract the benchmark and multiply it with the 97.5. And if you use the example of Morocco, for example, with 990 kilograms, you would end up with around 25 euros CBAM levy to be paid based on that formula. If you would use verified emissions, for example, and we assume the plant there had emissions of 880, and it's the verified emissions you use, you would land somewhere around 17, 18 euros CBAM levy for this year. Just to give you an idea of where the CBAM price would be currently, based also on the ETS price that is applied this year or in the first quarter of 2026. So are we happy with the implementation of the CBAM so far? I would say we have still mixed feelings. I think many parts of this legal framework are well implemented and thoroughly thought of. But of course, we still see there's refinement needed. It's still, I think, not yet smoothly working, and it lacks transparency here and there. And also I would say the enforcement of the rules also on the ground is something that needs to be worked on. And this is something the EU Commission is also considering. So to give you a small outlook of what's still coming or what's currently missing, first of all, the EU Commission is intending to expand the scope of the CBAM to cover a lot more products, especially in the steel and aluminium sector, most of all downstream products. Then it's, of course, the question of how to address anti-circumvention strategies. So the question, how can we make sure that the imported products have properly declared the CO2 footprint? And also the third point is how we deal with the exports I mentioned before. More specifically, I believe it's important to have a bit more transparency. Also, during the year on the imported quantities on the embedded CO2, I think this helps EU producers, but also third country producers to better understand how the CBAM system works. I think one point of action is certainly to look into the granularity of the product codes. This could be more detailed, for example. It's the question of resource shuffling and abusive practices that might take place or not, but nevertheless, you need instruments to deal with that. It's also to reflect CO2 prices that have been already paid in third countries. The Commission is working also on how to reflect this in the CBAM. Okay, it's also I think the cooperation of CBAM authorities in the different member states, and of course, and which is of utmost importance for third country producers, is the availability of CBAM verifiers, and they have to be accredited in the member states, and this takes time, and this is a process that is currently ongoing. So allow me, although I'm a bit progressed in time, Mr. Mike Noch, to give me maybe 2 or 3 more minutes just on the CO2 monitoring, reporting and verification. I will be rather quick. I believe many of you that are familiar with the ETS, that you will already have implemented a CO2 monitoring plan with all the testing, sampling, infrastructure, personnel, and that you need for that. And I just wanted to make transparent that it's certainly helpful to prepare for that CO2 reporting under the CBAM. And I think this 2 years of reporting phase was a good way to try and to gain experience. So it's really about developing a methodology in each installation on the product specific emissions and also in the monitoring of production volumes if you have different products. This monitoring plan is then the basis also for the reporting of the emissions. It's really about the sampling and analysis of input factors such as fuels, also SRF, alternative fuels of all sorts that are used, how to make sure you analyze the carbon content of these products properly in line with the rules and so on. So this is something I think that needs to be looked at. Then you have to prepare the verification audits. Usually they happen in the first quarter of the year after the imports happen. So for 2026, usually the verification period is the first quarter of the following year, or for CBAM, maybe also the second quarter. So this is the time where the auditors will be on site, will check together with the team in the installation whether all the data is properly covered in the emission report, and then of course to make sure that everybody is ready to submit the CBAM report in a timely manner before September 30th. As VDZ, we have a long experience in the ETS from an industry perspective on the one hand, but also being an accredited verification body under the ETS. So we're also ready to help when it comes to preparing verification, also consulting and to set up a CO2 monitoring and reporting system. We've done this globally for many years. Also, we are happy to help with pre-auditing to make sure that a CO2 verification runs smoothly eventually. And of course, we have a broad range of, I would say, training and seminars also to make you familiar with certain aspects of the CO2 reporting, of technical aspects of process technology, and dealing with alternative fuels, the weighing and measurement, and many other things. So if you're interested, please feel free to reach out to us. For now, I'd like to close. Thanks very much for your attention, and I'm happy to receive questions from the audience. Thank you.